Welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Derling. Thank you for tuning in for another episode. On this episode, I'm going to go through my Cheap Trick 8-track collection, a collection that's almost complete. I think that I'm only missing one, so I'm satisfied in showing you what I've got. Cheap Trick, of course, started in '77 as far as recording. They'd actually been together before that, and they wrote a ton of songs. A lot of songs that didn't even make their albums, but so they, in the heart of the 8-track era, it started in 1977 with their debut album, Selftitled. They did two self-titled albums with black and white covers. Of course, the second one was in '97. This is a US copy on Epic Records. It says demonstration not for sale stamped on it. This album didn't exactly set the world on fire, had no hit singles off it, but it became better known based on the albums that followed, and it's a lot of hardcore fans' favorite Cheap Trick album. Second one also came out in 1977. This was a time period where bands were very, very prolific. Didn't take long. They went into the studio, back out. In color. This is a Canadian 8-track. As you can see, it's very, very different in its look. Still on Epic Records, even though it says Columbia. I don't know why they did that, but it's got the Epic logo here, Columbia logo there. I don't know. Actually, a lot of these are Canadian 8-tracks, which is weird because they were much more successful in the States, and it's easier to find US copies. But I was glad to be able to track down some ones from my home country. This contained the original version of I Want You to Want Me, which was not the hit. Big difference in between the two versions of those. One of their best albums, 1978, Heaven Tonight, another Canadian 8-track. This contains Surrender. It wasn't a top 40 single, but it's a well-known song by them. And two of their heaviest songs, Stiff Competition and Auf Wiedersehen. I love the fact that somebody wrote 50 on there, 50 cents. That is what I paid for this, though. Another good album from them. Of course, Cheap Trick fans know the history. They know that the next one, which turned out to be their breakthrough, wasn't meant to come out domestically. It was only meant to come out in Japan. It's Cheap Trick at Budokan. Due to strong import sales, it was eventually released. I think it was released in 1979, although it says 1978 on it. And what I think is cool about this is that, of course, Sony bought out CBS in the late 80s, so everything that was on CBS records became Sony Music Entertainment, but not back then, not in North America. But here it's the only 8-track I have that says Epic Sony on it. Yeah, Epic/Sony. So that kind of makes it unique for that. In 1979, another one of their strong albums, another platinum one, Dream Police, title song was a hit for them, and one of my favorite Cheap Trick songs. Another Canadian 8-track. A little different shape to this one. Now they're using the classic Epic logo as we know it. Voices was another great song, and it was another hit off of this album. My personal favorite Cheap Trick album is a sort of a dark horse album for them. Came out in 1980. They were, huge Beatles fans. So this was the one time on a studio album they got to work with Beatles producer Sir George Martin. The result was All Shook Up. I love this album. It's a weird album cover. They kind of had a new wave look, but musically, it's classic Cheap Trick. There were no huge songs off of this one. Stop This Game was the closest thing to a hit, but I just love this album, and this is another Canadian edition on Epic. If you're sick of hearing Surrender, I Want You to Want Me, The Flame, but you think you kind of like Cheap Trick, I would check this album out, even if you just check it out on YouTube for starters. Just type in Cheap Trick, All Shook Up. I think you'll like it. Next one, 1982, the last Cheap Trick album to come out in retail. This is One on One. It's not one that you see very often on 8-track. This is a US version on Epic. It's a little beat up. I had to search a little bit to find this. On this album, Tom Peterson was gone, and his initial replacement was a guy named Pete Comita, but he didn't last long. And then John Brandt came in, this guy up here, and he would be with them up until about 1987 when Tom Peterson came back. Now, the next album to come out was in 1983, Next Position Please. It didn't come out in retail. There is at least a Columbia House version of it out there. I don't know about RCA Music Service, but that's on my want list. I've been looking for that one. But I've got one more thing to show you. In 2009, Cheap Trick put out a new album called The Latest, which would end up being their last with Bunny Carlos, and they did something really cool with it. They actually put it out on 8-track. So this is an 8-track from 2009. I don't know how many of these that they made, but I was lucky enough to track one down. And the the word is they wanted to put out an 8-track because they wanted to have the #1 selling something for the week. The latest is kind of written in a Beatles type font. And the way that they've got 8-track cartridge down here, I think they borrowed that from an old Capitol one. It's weird to see an 8-track with a website on it. It's at cheaptrick.com. I was really glad to track this one down. There are other 8-tracks that contain Cheap Trick music because they were very prolific as far as soundtracks. All the way up to the Top Gun soundtrack in 1986 with Mighty Wings. That's available on 8-track. I don't typically collect soundtracks, but those are my Cheap Trick 8-tracks. Thanks for watching Tim's Vinyl Confessions.